White cop attacks black woman in court without knowing she's his new police chief. In the hushed corridors of the Sullivan County Courthouse in Monticello, New York, a place known for its imposing stone walls and stern judges, an explosive encounter is about to unravel. Officer Richard "Rick" Harding, a grizzled veteran of the local police force, stands rigid, brimming with impatience. He's here to testify in a routine case, or so he believes. What he doesn't know is that the woman he's about to confront, under the glaring fluorescent lights of that courtroom, holds a title that will shake his life to its core. When their paths collide, the consequences will be swift, shocking, and utterly unforgettable. Officer Richard "Rick" Harding had been patrolling the streets of Monticello, New York, for over 15 years. He was a second-generation policeman, always proud of wearing the crisp blue uniform and that gleaming badge pinned to his chest. His father had served before him, retiring with honors and stories told around the dinner table that made law enforcement sound like a calling rather than a career. But somewhere along Rick's journey, that sense of duty had become tangled with bitterness and cynicism. It was evident in how he interacted with the people he was sworn to protect, his rough manner, his quickness to judge. He didn't consider himself a bad cop. In his mind, he was just a realist, someone who saw things for how they really were. Sullivan County Courthouse loomed in the heart of Monticello, an austere building with tall Grecian columns lining its front entrance. Locals whispered about the many stories that had played out within its halls, the scandalous political trials, the small-town disputes taken too far, and the heartbreaking custody battles. And while Monticello wasn't exactly a bustling metropolis, the courthouse stayed busy with a mix of petty crimes, civil disagreements, and occasional high-profile cases. This morning, the fluorescent lights flickered in the long corridor leading to Courtroom B, where Rick had been summoned to testify in a minor assault case. The routine was all too familiar. Fill out the necessary paperwork, wait for the bailiff to call him in, then recite the details of an arrest from memory. He was good at it. He prided himself on how thoroughly he documented incidents, even though some of those incidents were overshadowed by his own biases. But to him, that was just part of the job. He rarely questioned whether any prejudice clouded his judgment. If someone had asked him how he felt about the changes rumored to be happening within the Monticello Police Department, he would have shrugged. Everyone in town was buzzing about the new leadership rumored to arrive that very week, but Rick didn't pay attention to the grapevine. His mind was on more immediate concerns: his mortgage, his aging mother's medical bills, and the tension gripping his neck whenever he thought about life beyond the force. He was the kind of officer who believed if you kept your head down and did your job, you'd be rewarded for your loyalty. In stark contrast, in a quiet corner of the hallway, a tall, poised black woman named Cassandra "Cassie" Monroe observed the swirl of activity. She was dressed in a sharp charcoal gray suit, with her hair elegantly styled into locks that framed her face. Her eyes were keen and steady, missing nothing that transpired around her. Cassie had just arrived in Monticello the previous night, hardly having time to adjust to the crisp autumn air, or even finalize the details of her new office. But she had a mission: to bring some much-needed reform to a department that had been stuck in the past. By her side stood Monticello's mayor, Patricia Melendez, anxiously whispering last-minute details into Cassie's ear. Patricia was the one who had lobbied hard for Cassie's appointment as the new chief of police. She had seen too many excessive force complaints and too many divide-and-conquer tactics used by certain officers. There was a sense of relief in Monticello when word spread that a fresh face with a strong track record was taking over the top seat. Cassie Monroe had spent years in larger cities, championing community policing initiatives that improved trust between the force and the neighborhood. She specialized in de-escalation techniques, building empathy among officers and ensuring accountability, even when it meant ruffling feathers. But for now, Cassie was incognito, waiting to finalize some administrative paperwork before her public introduction to the police department. She didn't want to draw attention in the courthouse, and so she asked the mayor to keep her presence under wraps. Patricia obliged, only introducing Cassie as a high-level consultant for the Monticello PD whenever they encountered curious glances. As they approached Courtroom B, Cassie noticed a tall, broad-shouldered cop standing near the door. He had stern features, dark blonde hair cropped short, a thick mustache, and eyes that seemed perpetually narrowed, as if everyone around him was a suspect. He was fiddling with some files, occasionally glancing at his watch as though something or someone was late. The tension radiating off him was palpable even from a distance. Unbeknownst to Cassie, this was Officer Rick Harding. As fate would have it, circumstances were about to conspire in a way neither Cassie nor Rick could have anticipated. Their worlds would collide in that stuffy courtroom, under the relentless gaze of the judge and the hushed whisper of the town's gossip. The seeds of tension and confrontation had already been sown long before, and here, in the halls of the Sullivan County Courthouse, they would begin to bear fruit. The steady tapping of shoes against the marble floors resounded in the corridor. Lawyers, clerks, witnesses, and defendants were all funneling toward Courtroom B. The morning's docket was crowded. It included everything from small claims to misdemeanors. The old wooden benches inside the courtroom were nearly full, creaking every time someone squeezed in to sit. The judge assigned to the day's cases was Judge Regina Walker, a seasoned jurist known for her no-nonsense approach and distaste for drawn-out theatrics. Cassandra Monroe took a seat in the back corner of the courtroom. The mayor, Patricia, excused herself to handle another matter with the clerk's office. Cassie didn't mind. She preferred to watch proceedings quietly, gleaning a sense of how justice was dispensed here. From what she'd heard, Monticello's judicial system had its fair share of complexities, but it mostly functioned with a rigid adherence to procedure. Across the aisle, Rick Harding sat on a bench reserved for law enforcement officers waiting to testify. Despite the crowd, there was a noticeable bubble of empty space around him, as if his stern presence warded people off. He thumbed through his notes, reminding himself of the details of the assault case. A teenage boy had allegedly attacked another teen at a local park. Rick had been the arresting officer, and the prosecution wanted his testimony to clinch the case. He was lost in thought, running through the events as he remembered them, when a soft voice broke his concentration. "Excuse me," said Cassie, who had come over to the officer's bench looking for a spot to sit while she waited. "May I sit here?" Rick glanced up briefly. He registered her as a black woman, tall and poised, but that was about the extent of his courtesy. His eyes flickered with an air of dismissal as he motioned curtly at the bench, half permission, half annoyance. He didn't bother speaking. In his mind, she was just another face in the crowd, someone who would likely be gone in a moment. Cassie gave a polite nod and settled down at the far edge of the bench, leaving space between them. She noted his body language, stiff spine, tense jaw, a slight tapping of his foot. She could sense he was on edge. She might have tried to strike up a casual conversation, something about the weather or the busy courtroom, had his demeanor not been so unwelcoming. Instead, she kept her focus on the front of the room, where a bailiff was calling out case numbers. After a few cases, the bailiff finally called, "The State versus Ethan Sanderson." That was Rick's cue. He stood up, smoothed the wrinkles from his uniform, and made his way to the witness stand. Cassie watched with subdued interest. She had seen this type of cop countless times before, rigid, by the book, and if local rumors were accurate, occasionally too quick to use force. As the new chief, she'd need to work with him. But at this moment, she was content simply to observe. Rick gave his testimony. His recollection of the arrest was precise, though tinged with his usual harsh tone. He described how he'd arrived at the scene, found two teenagers scuffling, and broke up the fight. One boy had a bruised rib, the other had a broken nose. It was a messy altercation, but Rick's words painted a picture where Ethan was the clear aggressor. The prosecution nodded along, as if Rick's words sealed the matter in stone. Halfway through his testimony, Ethan's defense lawyer, a wiry man named Alan Pierce, began a cross-examination. He pointed out potential inconsistencies, asking Rick how he had determined who started the fight, questioning whether Rick had thoroughly investigated both sides. Cassie noticed Rick's frustration building. His narrowed eyes, the tick in his jaw, told her he wasn't used to being second-guessed and he didn't like it. Eventually, Judge Walker intervened, reminding everyone to keep calm and stick to the facts. That effectively concluded the hearing for that case, leaving the final ruling for another day. Rick stepped down, a faint scowl etched into his features. He hated these legal formalities. In his view, if he arrested someone, they were guilty. End of story. He returned to his seat on the bench, dropping heavily into it. Cassie discreetly watched him, noticing how his tension hadn't dissipated even though his testimony was done. Moments later, the bailiff called out, "Next case, People versus Allison Green." Cassie stiffened, instantly recognizing the name from the paperwork she had reviewed. Allison Green was a local activist who claimed police misconduct during her arrest at a peaceful protest. Cassie had been reading up on that file because it raised concerns about excessive force. And from the incident report, she recalled that the officer in question was none other than Richard Harding. Across the room, Judge Walker's face revealed an undercurrent of tension. This was a high-profile local matter, and the judge seemed ready for another round of friction. Cassie had only been in Monticello a short time, but she had read enough about the case to know it was significant. The protesters were rallying for better oversight of the local police, and the situation escalated. Allison Green claimed that Officer Harding tackled her without warning, injuring her shoulder. Rick stood again, this time with visible annoyance. He walked up to the witness box like a man about to face an interrogation he found beneath him. Cassie felt her heart tighten. She had seen this scenario play out before. A community activist trying to hold law enforcement accountable, a combative officer who didn't see the bigger picture, and a town caught in the crossfire. As Rick settled in for questioning, Cassie took a deep breath. Though she was the soon-to-be police chief, she was here only as an observer today. But something in her gut told her that she would soon be more than an observer. Much more. "Allison Green, please step forward," the bailiff announced. A young black woman with braided hair stood, her left arm in a sling. She carried herself with dignity, though the tremor in her free hand suggested she wasn't entirely unafraid. Her eyes met Rick's, but there was no submission in her gaze, only a simmering demand for accountability. The courtroom air felt charged, as though everyone present anticipated that sparks would fly. The local newspapers had been covering Allison's story for weeks. Grassroots groups had rallied around her, claiming her arrest was another example of Monticello Police Department's pattern of heavy-handed tactics. For Rick, the entire narrative was a slap in the face. He viewed himself as the embodiment of law and order, and any accusations of misconduct felt like a personal attack. The prosecutor asked Rick to recount the events of that protest. Rick described arriving at the demonstration, noticing Allison among the crowd. He alleged that Allison was shouting profanities and refused to move back when asked. In his words, she was causing a disturbance and threatening public safety. So he moved in to arrest her. He asserted that she resisted, forcing him to use necessary physical force. Allison's attorney then began cross-examining Rick. It was a meticulous dissection of Rick's account. The attorney pointed out that the protest had been peaceful, with no documented violence, and challenged Rick's assertion that Allison was a threat. They introduced cell phone footage that showed Allison standing still, chanting slogans, and then suddenly being pushed to the ground by a rushing officer, allegedly Rick himself. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The difference between Rick's testimony and the video was stark. Cassie shifted uncomfortably in her seat. It was never easy to see an officer's credibility under attack, but if that officer's statements didn't align with the facts, the department had a bigger problem. She watched Rick's face contort in anger. He insisted the video didn't capture what happened moments prior. He insisted that the camera angle was misleading, that Allison had swung at him. But the video offered no such evidence. It only showed the chaotic moment of her takedown. Allison stood to make a statement, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. She described the protest's purpose, to demand better community policing and an end to racial profiling. She explained how she'd locked arms with fellow protesters, refusing to disperse but not engaging in any violence. "I wasn't attacking him," she said, nodding toward Rick. "I was exercising my right to free speech. Then he charged me like a linebacker." Judge Walker asked for order in the courtroom as murmurs grew louder. Rick's frustration was visible. Cassie saw the color rising in his face, his grip on the wooden railing whitening his knuckles. He despised being portrayed as a brute. Cassie understood that feeling, but she also knew that if the video was accurate, Rick was clearly in the wrong. The judge signaled a recess to review the evidence in chambers. As people rose from their seats, the tension migrated into the corridor. Allison's supporters whispered among themselves, throwing reproachful glances at Rick. He stared at them coldly, as if daring them to speak louder. It was a standoff of sorts. Two sides believing they were righteous, no one ready to blink first. Cassie felt an urgency swelling within her. She was about to assume command of these officers. If Rick Harding was emblematic of the department's entrenched culture, she had a mountain to climb. She considered whether to step outside and make a quick call to the mayor, but opted to stay put and wait for the judge's return. Perhaps seeing this entire matter play out in full view would give her clearer insight into what needed to be done. Soon, the bailiff called everyone back in. Judge Walker, looking more stern than ever, addressed the court. "I've reviewed the footage and the statements provided. There is sufficient evidence that calls Officer Harding's version of events into question. However, it would be premature to render a final decision without further testimony and an internal affairs report. For now, Miss Green is released on her own recognizance, pending further investigation." Allison's eyes lit up with relief. Rick, on the other hand, muttered something under his breath, something Cassie couldn't quite catch. But the tone of it, the bitterness, was unmistakable. The judge rapped her gavel and closed the session. As people began to file out, Rick stormed toward Allison, ignoring the bailiff's cautionary calls. "This isn't over," he hissed, leaning in far too close for comfort. "You can't twist the facts forever." Allison shrank back but held her ground. Before she could respond, Rick's eyes locked onto Cassie, who had stood to intervene if necessary. Their gazes met for the briefest second. Cassie saw the unbridled anger in his stare. Rick saw an imposing figure who, in his mind, was probably just another civilian meddling in police matters. He turned away quickly, dismissing her presence as unimportant. What neither realized in that heated moment was how drastically their relationship was about to change. Unbeknownst to them both, Cassie was scheduled to be introduced as Monticello's new chief of police within hours. Their next meeting would not be as two strangers in a crowded courtroom, but as subordinate and superior, locked in a battle not just for professional respect, but also for the soul of Monticello's police department. The rest of the morning at the Sullivan County Courthouse was overshadowed by the tension from the Green case. Word spread quickly through the corridors that a major blow had been dealt to Officer Harding's credibility. Some onlookers believed the case would open up Pandora's box regarding questionable practices within the Monticello PD. Others dismissed it as a one-time event inflated by social media fervor. In any case, the courthouse was abuzz with speculation. As Cassie made her way to the lobby, she was intercepted by Mayor Patricia Melendez, who had returned from her own errands. "I heard the hearing caused quite a stir," Patricia said, glancing around to ensure nobody was within earshot. She quickly ushered Cassie into a quieter corner. "Are you all right? I know how these things can be." Cassie nodded. "I'm fine. Just concerned. That was a tough one to watch. There's definitely a problem brewing, Patricia. There's a clear disconnect between the officer's account and the video. It's not good." Patricia sighed. "We've had complaints about Harding before, but nothing that stuck. He's well connected and has some supporters in the department. However, I have faith that once you officially take the reins, you'll lead the changes we need." Cassie frowned. "I just hope I'm not stepping into a war zone. If the department is as divided as it seems, this won't be easy." The mayor placed a reassuring hand on Cassie's shoulder. "We both knew this wouldn't be easy, but you have the experience. The council is behind you, and so am I. The official announcement is this afternoon at City Hall. Let's get you sworn in, and then we can talk strategy. For now, keep a low profile if possible." They parted ways, with Cassie heading out of the courthouse and stepping into the crisp autumn daylight. She took a moment to gather her thoughts on the courthouse steps. She recalled Rick Harding's anger, his dismissive glare. It wasn't personal, she reminded herself. He likely would have treated any perceived critic the same way. Yet a chill coursed through her, an intuition that told her things were about to get much more complicated. Meanwhile, Rick was fuming in an empty hallway near the witness rooms. He'd stormed out of the courtroom after Judge Walker's decision, ignoring the side eyes from fellow officers who'd seen the footage. The confrontation with Allison Green in open court had riled him up. And that woman, he didn't even know her name, who'd looked at him like he was in the wrong. He clenched his fists at the memory. He stomped toward the exit, determined to put the courthouse behind him. Yet as he stepped into the bustling street, a swirl of reporters and activists stood outside. They immediately recognized him, cameras and microphones pivoting in his direction like sunflowers tracking the sun. In the throng, he spotted Allison Green as well, giving a statement. She glanced at him momentarily but continued speaking, describing how she felt justice might finally be served. Before any reporter could corner him, Rick marched off. He hated the spotlight, hated the idea of being fodder for a local headline like "Cop Under Fire." He told himself that Allison and her supporters were just stirring trouble. He'd been in real confrontations. He'd broken up fights, tackled armed suspects, put his life on the line more times than he could count. Did that count for nothing? Grumbling to himself, he headed to his patrol car. He turned the key in the ignition, releasing a tense exhale as the engine roared to life. The next stop would be the station, where he intended to file any necessary reports and dodge any superiors who might have questions about the hearing. He knew that sooner or later, he'd face an internal review. But he still believed he could outlast any scrutiny. After all, he'd been an officer here for 15 years. That loyalty had to mean something. The drive back to the station took him along Monticello's main avenues, past the quaint diners, the antique stores, the old movie theater that still boasted a neon marquee. It was a town that prided itself on its history and small-town values. Rick wondered when those values had started to clash with what he considered real policing. He muttered curses under his breath about outsiders and bleeding hearts who didn't understand the pressures of the job. If only he knew who Cassie Monroe really was, and that she was no outsider at all, but soon to be his commanding officer. Their collision course was set, and the road ahead was paved with tension, misunderstandings, and an undeniable reckoning. Afternoon sunlight spilled through the tall windows of Monticello's City Hall, illuminating the rows of chairs set up for a press conference. A modest crowd gathered, local reporters, community leaders, curious citizens, and a smattering of uniformed police officers. The mayor's office had sent out a notice that the new chief of police would be publicly introduced at exactly 2 p.m., marking a significant transition for the Monticello PD. At precisely 1:59 p.m., Cassandra Monroe entered from a side door, accompanied by Mayor Patricia Melendez and 2 members of the city council. She wore a newly pressed police chief's uniform, the gold shield gleaming against her charcoal gray jacket. The crowd immediately noticed her calm but commanding presence. Whispers rippled through the assembly. Some recognized her from news articles detailing her progressive policing initiatives in other cities. Others had never seen her before, but were struck by her poised demeanor. Rick Harding was among the uniformed officers in the back row. He had arrived late, only because the station's watch commander insisted all available officers attend the announcement. Standing with his arms crossed, he had been half listening to the mayor's opening remarks about new leadership and fresh direction. He cared little for political fanfare. His mood was still sour from the courthouse fiasco. Then, the moment that would shake his world arrived. Patricia gestured grandly. "Ladies and gentlemen, It is my distinct honor to introduce Monticello's new Chief of Police, Cassandra Monroe." A ripple of applause broke out, but it was mingled with the buzz of astonishment. Rick's eyes snapped forward, fixating on the figure stepping up to the podium. It was the same tall, dignified black woman he had dismissed in the courthouse hallway. The one who'd sat near him, who he had spared barely a glance. For a second, his breath caught in his throat. A flurry of thoughts collided in his mind. Confusion, disbelief, maybe even a twinge of dread. Cassie approached the microphone, cleared her throat, and began speaking. "Good afternoon, everyone. I'm humbled and honored to serve as Monticello's new Chief of Police. My mission is straightforward, to protect and serve every member of this community, fairly, justly, and with full accountability. I believe in working alongside our residents, building trust, and making sure the Monticello PD becomes a model for community policing in our state and beyond." The applause grew louder. Mayor Melendez grinned broadly, clearly relieved that Cassie's first impression was so positive. Cameras flashed, capturing the moment for the evening news. Rick, standing in the back, felt his stomach churn. Her voice, measured, resolute, resonated through the auditorium, and a knot of tension tightened in his chest. He remembered how he'd brushed her off in the courthouse, how he'd nearly confronted her, only to redirect his anger at Allison Green. But what really rattled him was the knowledge that his soon-to-be direct superior was the same woman who'd seen him at his worst moment, seething and dismissive. Cassie continued, "Some of you have experienced friction with law enforcement and we're committed to addressing that. We'll be conducting a thorough review of our policies, especially concerning use of force. We'll establish stronger community relationships, and above all, we'll strive to earn and maintain your trust." More applause. A few onlookers called out words of encouragement or asked questions. When the Quanda session began, a reporter from the local paper stepped forward. "Chief Monroe, can you comment on the ongoing court case involving Officer Harding and Allison Green?" A hush fell. Cassie met the reporter's gaze, her expression serious. "I'm aware of that case. As chief, I won't comment on specifics of an active legal matter, but I can say that fairness and justice must guide us. The department will cooperate fully with the investigation, and I encourage transparency in all proceedings." Rick's jaw clenched. He felt as though every eye in the room had turned to him at the reporter's mention of his name. In truth, only a few scattered glances came his way, but in that moment the humiliation burned through him like acid. He was too proud and too used to being untouchable to accept that he was suddenly under the microscope. As the conference wrapped up, Cassie stepped away from the podium to mingle briefly with attendees. She shook hands with community leaders, city council members, even a few watchful citizens who approached her. At last, she made her way to the rear of the room, where Rick stood frozen like a statue. She extended her hand, her face kind but reserved. "It's nice to meet you, Officer Harding. I look forward to working with you," she said, her voice calm. He stared at her outstretched hand for a brief second, then shook it with the mechanical stiffness of someone who had no choice. A flurry of conflicting emotions churned inside him: anger, embarrassment, defiance, maybe even fear. "Chief," he muttered. He quickly excused himself, turning on his heel and leaving the room before she could say anything else. Cassie watched him retreat, her hand still lingering in the air. She'd seen officers like him before, men who believed their authority was absolute, who resisted change even when it was desperately needed. She understood that bridging the gap between them wouldn't happen overnight, but that didn't change the fact that a fault line had emerged in the Monticello Police Department, and she, Cassandra Monroe, was standing right on top of it, determined to make sure the foundation was rebuilt, not just for herself, but for everyone in Monticello who deserved a better path forward. The next morning, Cassandra Monroe arrived at the Monticello Police Department headquarters just before dawn. She parked in the designated chief's spot, feeling a slight tremor of excitement and anxiety. The building was a squat brick structure that had seen better days. The windows had a smudged film from years of weather and insufficient maintenance. But within these walls, a shift was about to begin. one that Cassie hoped would transform how policing was done in this town. She stepped inside, greeted by the harsh glow of fluorescent lights. The overnight shift was winding down, and a few bleary-eyed officers offered polite nods. Everyone had heard the news by now. Monticello had its first black female chief of police. Some welcomed it, hoping for modern reforms. Others, like Rick Harding, remained deeply skeptical, if not outright resistant. Cassie walked directly to her new office, a space that smelled faintly of stale coffee and old files. The desk was cluttered with stacks of paperwork that the previous chief had left behind. She set down her coffee cup, rolled up her sleeves, and began sorting through it, finding everything from half-finished memos to internal complaints that never seemed to reach a conclusion. Outside her office, she could hear the early shift officers starting their day. Radios crackled with routine calls, and the hum of morning banter floated through the station. At 7 a.m. sharp, Cassie emerged to address the daily briefing, an event she intended to use as a way to introduce herself more personally to the rank and file. Officers gathered in the briefing room, a cramped space with old chairs and a whiteboard covered in unreadable scribbles. A hush fell as Cassie entered. She surveyed the faces, some curious, some apprehensive. And then, in the back, leaning against the wall with his arms folded, stood Rick Harding, face set in a stony mask. "Good morning, everyone," Cassie began. "I'm Chief Monroe. I know this is a new chapter for Monticello PD, and change can be uncomfortable. But I promise I'm here to work with you, not against you. My priority is to ensure that we serve this community with integrity, fairness, and transparency." She then delved into her plans, new training programs for de-escalation, a review of use of force policies, and more regular community outreach. Some officers perked up at these ideas. A few exchanged cautious looks, others remained guarded. After all, Monticello wasn't a big city, and to them, changes meant more work or more scrutiny. When Cassie opened the floor for questions, an older officer tentatively asked, "Chief, are you planning on bringing outside advisors, or is this something we're doing in-house?" Cassie nodded. "A little of both. We'll form committees within the department to contribute. But yes, I'll be consulting with professionals I trust. It's important we do this right." She scanned the room, her gaze inevitably landing on Rick, who hadn't moved from his spot by the wall. She could sense he had opinions, strong ones, but he remained silent. Finally, she concluded the briefing, encouraging everyone to keep an open line of communication. As the officers filed out, Cassie noticed Rick lingering, as if waiting until the room was empty. She braced herself for a potentially difficult conversation. Once the last officer left, Rick stepped forward. "Chief," he said tersely, "I thought you might want these." He handed her a few files labeled with the departmental complaint number, 22, 104, 22, 107, 22, 112. "Internal complaints," he explained. "Some from the public, some from officers. They've been piling up. Figured you'd want to see them." Cassie accepted the files, noticing that they concerned allegations of excessive force, some involving Rick himself. "Thank you, Officer Harding," she said, keeping her tone neutral. "I appreciate this. We'll review them thoroughly." A flicker of emotion passed through Rick's eyes. Irritation, perhaps. "Don't mention it," he muttered, then turned on his heel and left. Cassie sighed. The tension was tangible. She flipped through one of the files and saw that it detailed a complaint from Allison Green's protest group. It had never been properly closed or resolved. That alone told Cassie how deep the department's issues ran. Determined, she took the files to her office. She called in Lieutenant Grace Martinez, a steady, even-keeled officer she'd heard good things about. Together, they reviewed the documents. "This is going to be an uphill battle," Grace admitted. "Some officers are set in their ways, and we haven't had strong leadership in a while." Cassie nodded, her expression resolute. "Then we'll have to prove that accountability isn't the enemy. It's the pathway to respect, from the community and from each other." Outside, the day was just beginning. The phone started ringing more frequently. Patrol cars pulled out of the station's lot, heading to their beats. And in the midst of it all, Cassandra Monroe was already elbow-deep in the administrative tasks she needed to tackle to right this ship. In the back of her mind, though, she couldn't stop thinking about Rick Harding, his manner, his dismissiveness. She knew that if she was going to make meaningful changes, she'd have to confront the elephant in the room. Monticello's proud, entrenched faction of officers like Rick, who believed they were above scrutiny. And that confrontation wouldn't just be a formal process. It would be personal. 2 weeks passed like a whirlwind of meetings, paperwork, and strategic planning sessions. Cassandra Monroe wasted no time implementing small yet meaningful reforms. She initiated a Coffee with a Cop program, inviting residents to meet officers at local cafes to voice concerns and build rapport. She organized a training seminar on racial bias, mandatory for all personnel. And she set a zero-tolerance policy for delayed or incomplete investigations into citizen complaints. The changes garnered mixed reactions. Some officers welcomed the new guidelines, relieved that someone finally cared about departmental integrity. Others saw it as needless bureaucracy, convinced that Monticello didn't need city slicker reforms. At the forefront of the resistance was Rick Harding. He attended each new training but did so with thinly veiled contempt, rolling his eyes whenever Cassie explained policy changes or new community outreach tactics. Tension simmered, threatening to boil over. Cassie felt it every time she passed Rick in the hallway or tried to engage him in a conversation. He'd offer curt one-word answers or feign a busy schedule. She didn't take it personally, but it weighed on her to see one of the department's most experienced officers shut himself off from progress. One evening, just as the sky turned lavender, Cassie was finishing up some overdue paperwork in her office. Most of the day shift had gone home, leaving the station eerily quiet. She was about to pack up when she heard raised voices echoing from down the corridor. Concerned, she stood and made her way toward the sound. She found Rick in a heated argument with a younger black officer, Damon Bailey, near the locker rooms. Rick's voice was taut with anger. Damon looked equally furious, though he tried to maintain composure. "I'm telling you, Harding," Damon was saying, "the way you handled that teenager's stop was inappropriate. You can't just call for backup and escalate when the kid was just walking home. We have guidelines for a reason." Rick spat back. "Guidelines? That kid was suspicious, wearing a hoodie and lurking near that closed store. I made a judgment call. Don't lecture me about guidelines when I've got 15 years on you." Damon squared his shoulders. "Suspicious how? Being black in a hoodie? We're supposed to rely on evidence, not stereotypes. This is exactly what Chief Monroe wants us to address." The mention of Cassie seemed to spark an even fiercer reaction in Rick. "I don't need the Chief's new wave nonsense," he seethed. "I know how to do my job. You'd do well to remember your place, Bailey." At that point, Cassie stepped forward. "Officer Harding, Officer Bailey, what's going on here?" She kept her voice calm but authoritative. Both men turned to her, startled. Damon looked relieved to see her, but Rick's expression hardened. He gestured dismissively. "Just a disagreement, Chief. Nothing you need to worry about." Cassie gave him a measured look. "This is my station, officer. If two of my officers are arguing about policing tactics, I need to worry." Rick's jaw tightened. "Fine," he muttered. "Bailey thinks I overreacted on a stop. I don't." Damon, emboldened by Cassie's presence, interjected. "He profiled a teenager, Chief. Stopped him for walking while black, basically. The kid had no weapons, no stolen goods. He was just heading home. But Harding yelled at him, forced him to put his hands up, called backup, and ended up letting him go when he found nothing." Cassie turned to Rick. "Is that true?" Rick bristled. "I used my discretion. That area has had burglaries. He matched the description of someone suspicious. End of story." "That's not end of story," Cassie said, voice firm. "I've said it before. We have protocols for a reason. This department will not stand for discriminatory stops. If you have a description, it needs to be specific, and there's a protocol for how to engage suspects respectfully." Rick let out a derisive snort. Respect. Some of us want to go home alive at the end of our shift. We don't have the luxury of coddling criminals and ignoring danger. A tense silence fell. Damon looked ready to explode. Cassie took a deep breath, measuring her words. Officer Harding, go file an incident report on the stop. I want a thorough account of why you found him suspicious and how you conducted the stop. Officer Bailey, you do the same with your observations. Rick glared at her. Are you serious? You're going to make me waste time writing up a simple field stop? Yes, Cassie replied, her tone unyielding. We document everything. That's the new protocol. If you had good reason, it should be easy to write up. For a moment, it seemed like Rick might challenge her. Then he huffed, turned on his heel and stomped off toward the administrative desk. Damon exhaled in relief. He turned to Cassie, gratitude mingled with lingering frustration in his eyes. Thank you, Chief. This has been happening too often, and I'm tired of it. Cassie nodded sympathetically. I understand, and we're going to address it. But remember, keep your composure. We're trying to fix the system from within. Damon nodded and left to write his report. Cassie stood there a moment longer, the echo of Rick's footsteps reverberating down the hallway. She felt the weight of the challenges that lay ahead. Confronting officers like Rick, who believed that authority trumped accountability, was never simple. But it was necessary. She returned to her office knowing tonight's paperwork just got a lot heavier. As the weeks went by, the tension surrounding Rick's excessive force complaint with Allison Green began to reach a tipping point. The internal investigation, which Cassie insisted on expediting, uncovered several disturbing inconsistencies in Rick's statements. Witnesses and cell phone videos contradicted him at multiple points. The city council called for a hearing to determine whether disciplinary action or even criminal charges were warranted. A date was set for the hearing. The very same Sullivan County Courthouse where Rick had previously testified. This time, however, he wasn't just a witness. He was the subject of scrutiny. Local activists rallied outside, while the media prepared for a potential landmark case that could set a precedent for accountability within small-town police departments. On the morning of the hearing, Rick arrived early, wearing his uniform as if it were a layer of armor. Despite growing evidence, he maintained his innocence, refusing to believe he'd done anything wrong. After all, he had used the same tactics for years, and no one had dared challenge him like this before. Allison Green came with her lawyer and a small group of supporters, some holding signs calling for justice and reform. Cassie arrived discreetly, not intending to testify but rather to observe. She took a seat in the back of the courtroom, her face unreadable as the proceedings got underway. The state's attorney presented footage from the protest, freeze-framing the moment Rick tackled Allison without issuing a clear warning or command. Witnesses testified that the crowd was peaceful, that Allison had complied with instructions to stay behind a barricade. The attorney drove home the point that Rick's actions were unprovoked and excessive. Rick's defense lawyer attempted to argue that the crowd was unruly, that Officer Harding had perceived a threat. But the judge, increasingly skeptical, pressed Rick to explain the discrepancy between his initial report and the video evidence. Rick stumbled through his explanation, claiming that the camera didn't show everything, that Allison had been shouting threats before the tackle, but no one else corroborated his story. Allison herself took the stand, describing the pain and humiliation she felt. I was there to protest peacefully, she said, but instead I ended up with a dislocated shoulder and a fear of the police who should be protecting us. Her voice trembled with emotion, yet her resolve was clear. Cassie watched Rick's reaction closely as Allison spoke. His gaze flickered with annoyance, but there was also a hint of something else, maybe desperation. He glanced around as if searching for an escape from the onslaught of damning evidence. Reality was closing in on him. When the state's attorney rested her case, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Judge Walker, the same jurist from before, announced that she would deliver her ruling the following week, taking into account the internal review, testimonies, and the new department policies under Chief Monroe. Rick left the courtroom in a flurry, ignoring reporters' questions. Outside, Cassie found him by the courthouse steps, staring at the group of activists across the street. They held signs that read "Justice for Allison" and "Accountability Now." His entire frame was rigid with tension. "Officer Harding," she said softly, approaching him. He turned abruptly, startled to see her. She continued, "I realize this is a difficult time for you, but this is the process. We can't ignore evidence." He scoffed. "You'd love to see me fired, wouldn't you?" Cassie shook her head. "I don't want to see any officer fired without cause. But if the evidence shows misconduct, the department has to take appropriate action. That's our job, to uphold the law, not skirt it." A flash of raw anger crossed his face. "You don't know me, Chief. You don't know what it's like on the streets, or the dirt we have to wade through every day." Cassie maintained her composure. "I've been on plenty of streets, officer, and I understand the dirt, but we can't let it become us, that's all I'm trying to say." For a moment, she thought she saw the faintest crack in his facade, a flicker of introspection or regret. But then it was gone, replaced by his usual hardened glare. He turned away without another word, heading for his patrol car. As Cassie watched him drive off, she couldn't help but recall her own early days as an officer, the times she'd had to make snap decisions under pressure. But the difference was, she'd taken accountability to heart, adapting her methods when confronted with her own mistakes. Rick's refusal to self-reflect was his undoing, and now, karma was bearing down on him with a force he could no longer outrun. The day Judge Walker announced her decision, the Sullivan County Courthouse was at full capacity. Word of the impending ruling had spread far, drawing not just local residents but media outlets from nearby cities. Tension hung in the air like a thundercloud ready to burst. Allison Green and her supporters filled one side of the gallery, quietly hopeful. Many held hands in solidarity, bracing themselves for the moment that could either solidify their faith in the legal system or dash it entirely. On the other side, a handful of off-duty officers and Rick's family members sat in a tight cluster, supporting him with wary eyes. Cassandra Monroe arrived early, taking her usual spot in the back row. She was not there to gloat or pass judgment. She simply wanted to bear witness to a turning point in Monticello's law enforcement narrative. She noticed a few of her officers scattered throughout the room. Some offered respectful nods. Others avoided her gaze, their loyalties torn between solidarity with a fellow cop and the realization that justice had to prevail. At exactly 10 a.m., Judge Walker entered. The courtroom fell silent. With a steady voice, she detailed her findings. The evidence, video footage, witness testimonies, internal department records, proved that Rick Harding used excessive force and failed to follow protocol in dealing with Allison Green. Her words were measured but decisive. "As an officer of the law," Judge Walker said, "it is your duty to use the minimal necessary force. The video evidence and witness accounts clearly contradict your claim that Miss Green posed an immediate threat. This court finds that you, Officer Harding, acted with an unwarranted level of aggression. Furthermore, your subsequent reports contained inaccuracies that suggest deliberate falsification." A collective hush fell over the room. Rick Harding sat at the defense table, hands clenching the edge so hard his knuckles turned white. The judge continued, her tone unwavering. "I'm recommending disciplinary action up to and including termination, pending a final review by the Monticello Police Department and its chief. Additionally, I am referring this case to the district attorney for possible charges related to the falsification of official documents." The moment she finished speaking, murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some activists exhaled audible sighs of relief, others dabbed tears from their eyes. The group around Rick stiffened, stunned. Allison Green lowered her head and wept softly, the release of months of anxiety catching up with her. Rick's lawyer tried to object, but the judge firmly stated that her decision was final as far as the court was concerned. The hearing ended with the bang of a gavel that seemed to echo endlessly. Outside, the scene was chaotic. Reporters clustered like bees, shouting questions at Allison, her lawyer, and anyone else who might offer a soundbite. Camera flashes lit up the overcast sky, Supporters of Allison cheered for justice served, while Rick's family huddled close, some openly crying. Cassie waited for the crowd to thin, then approached Allison. The two women shared a brief moment of understanding, though it was tinged with the gravity of the situation. "I'm sorry this happened to you," Cassie said. "We have a lot of work to do, but I promise you, changes are coming." Allison nodded, her eyes still watery. "Thank you, Chief. It's a start." Turning away from the throng, Cassie saw Rick standing by the courthouse steps, staring off into the distance like a man who'd just lost his footing. She walked over, treading carefully. "Officer Harding, Rick, do you need a ride back to the station?" He didn't respond at first, then his voice came in a hoarse whisper. "I guess I won't be an officer for much longer, right?" He turned to her, and in his eyes she saw a man grappling with the collapse of a reality he had clung to. "Everything's crumbling." Cassie shook her head gently. "This is a critical moment, Rick. You could reflect on what went wrong, maybe learn from it." He cut her off. "Learn what? That the system I served for 15 years chews you up and spits you out the moment some activist brandishes a camera phone?" A bitter laugh escaped his lips. "I should have seen this coming. The department's changed." "Yes, it has," Cassie agreed, "and it needed to." He stared at her for a moment, as if debating whether to lash out, but perhaps the fight had left him. Shoulders sagging, he walked away, blending into the crowd until he disappeared from view. Cassie's heart felt heavy. She believed in second chances, in the power of redemption, but some lines once crossed change everything. Rick Harding would likely face criminal charges if the district attorney proceeded. His days in law enforcement were numbered, and he had no one to blame but himself. Taking a deep breath, Cassie walked back to her car. The steady drizzle that had begun felt like a cleansing, washing away the stubborn remnants of the old guard's hold on Monticello. She thought about the path forward, rebuilding trust, instituting fair policies, hiring and training officers who believed in serving the community, not dominating it. And she knew deep down that even though today was a victory for accountability, the road ahead remained long and demanding. But for the first time since she'd arrived, Cassandra Monroe felt a surge of optimism. The reckoning had come, and despite the pain it caused, real change was finally possible. In the aftermath of Rick Harding's downfall, a new spirit began to blossom in Monticello. Under Chief Cassie Monroe's vigilant leadership, community policing programs expanded. Open forums were held to rebuild faith in law enforcement, and the town watched as the promise of accountability took real shape. Though many hurdles remained, old prejudices, new challenges, the steps taken heralded a future guided by transparency and understanding. Thank you for watching and experiencing this emotional journey with us. If this story moved you, sparked your thoughts, or made you reflect on justice and change, we invite you to like this video, share it with others who might find it meaningful, and subscribe to our channel for more impactful stories. Your support helps us continue shining a light on the issues that matter. Thank you, once again, for being a part of this story's powerful message.